All right, so welcome to Reflective Writing. This is the third workshop in the Building Your Writing Foundation workshop series for this fall. This presentation is put on by the Academic Success Center. My name is Emily Jackson. I am a academic support specialist with the Academic Success Center as well. And my email, I did put it in the chat, but my email is also here on the screen. If you have any questions about the workshop after you have attended, I would be very happy to hear from you. You're very welcome to connect with me that way. Land acknowledgement before I begin. So RRC Polytech campuses are located on the lands of Anishinaabe, Inaniwak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. All right, so we're talking about reflective writing today, and this topic has been chosen as one of the foundational writing series subjects because, well, reflective writing actually comes up a lot at Red River College. It also comes up a lot in professional settings. You may be asked to reflect on something in the future, either academically or professionally. So what we talk about today is specifically about reflective writing assignments, but I hope that you are able to leave with a greater understanding of what it means when you are asked to reflect. Okay, so we'll start with what does that mean to reflect? What does it mean to learn is going to be a topic today as well. We'll connect reflective writing to our learning. And how can you write about what you've learned? Of course, the structure, I'll provide a structure for how you can communicate your learning in a reflective assignment. And then we'll look at some examples at the end. So this will be a full half hour. As I said before, you're welcome to use the chat if you have any questions as we go. All right, so a beautiful photo of a reflection in the water. What does it mean to reflect? When we're talking about the verb to reflect, we are thinking about considering something or thinking about something after it has happened, right? We're looking back on something. In this photo, the word reflect means to throw light back from a surface. So you could think about it in a way like you are seeing something in a new light when you consider something after it's happened and you work on maybe processing or reviewing or reflecting on what you have learned. So to reflect is all about what has happened after an experience or after something that you may have learned. Reflective writing assignments require you to think back on and describe something that's happened. You may be asked to think critically and analyze what happened. And you may be asked to explain what you would do differently in the future and why. So we're about a month into the fall term. Some of you may be in your 5th week of your fall term, and you may have been asked to do something like this. You may have been asked to think back on your experience during your first week of the program. You may be asked, you've completed module 1 and your instructor asked you to write a discussion post about what you've learned and analyze what you have done in class over the last month. You may be asked to think about what you're going to do differently as you learn the materials from Module 2. Some of these things might have been coming up already in your first few weeks of your program. But this is some of the language that are used in writing assignments. So why do instructors even ask us to do this? As I've said, it is a common type of writing that happens in an academic setting. And for lots of students, it's very unfamiliar. It may even feel a little bit unusual because you're being asked to share your own feelings, thoughts, experiences. So why do instructors assign reflective writing tasks? What is the purpose? Why do they want to know what you think or what you felt or what you experienced or what you learned? And why do they want to read that in a discussion post, for example? Well, reflective writing actually allows you to demonstrate your learning. It is proof of learning. And we'll look at how you can do this later. But if you were able to reflect or look back on an experience, for example, and describe that experience and then provide some explanation of what you learned or how you benefited from that experience in some way. And again, we're going to break that down into more detail and look at some examples. But this is actually a way of demonstrating what you have learned if you can explain it in a reflective written task. So for some students, it might feel a little strange. Well, why does my instructor care what I think? Or why does my instruction care how I felt after that experience? Well, it demonstrates that you in some way were able to make a connection to what you have learned. And that is a very important part of the learning process. When we're talking about learning and the learning process, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior that it is the result of experience. You could think of phrases like learning on the job or learn as you go. As we learn, we are actually gaining experience that changes what we know and then affects our behaviors. So when you're learning to do something new, you are gaining experience, which then allows you to perform or do that task better as you go. So that's what learning is. Learning is a relatively permanent change. Of course, we don't remember everything we've learned, which is why it's relatively permanent, not completely permanent. But it's a change in our behavior resulted from our experiences. So even if you think about if you're in your first term or maybe your second year, what have you learned at Red River so far that is related to what you're studying? And how has that maybe changed how you think about other things related to what you've learned? Or how has that maybe changed the way that you complete assignments or write tests? And how will that learning impact you when you go out and get a job and work in your field? Of course, it will impact you because you have more knowledge, you have more experience. So that's what learning is, this gaining of experience that affects our behaviors. And we're talking about learning as what happens in class, but remember, learning can happen in many, many different situations. It can happen when you're reading a book, when you go for a walk, talk to somebody new, maybe you watch a documentary or a movie, maybe you try something new, you bake something at home, you try some yoga, whatever it might be. All of those experiences can be learning experiences. So learning isn't just something that happens in a classroom. That's very important to remember. Okay, so we kind of reflected on this so far, but let's continue on. Generally, we can categorize learning into 3 areas. So we can learn knowledge. Knowledge is something that you know. So example, maybe you know the name of Canada's Governor General. If you don't, you could Google it and then you've learned it and you'll have gained a fact or a piece of knowledge. We can also categorize learning into skills or ability to do something, something that you can do. So for example, how to change a tire. This is an extremely useful skill. And finally, attitudes or values. So another way of thinking about this is something that you believe or something that you value, something you think is important. So for example, maybe you're in the early childhood education program and you have learned the importance of play for young children. This is something that you didn't know before. Now you know it, so it's part of your knowledge, but it's also something that you place a lot of value on, something you believe, something you really think is true and important, is that young children must have opportunities to play. So learning, we can learn knowledge, we can learn skills, and we can also learn attitudes or values about something. This is going to be very important when we look at structuring or how to write a reflective piece. So remember that learning is what is most important in your reflective writing. So whether it's knowledge, skills, or attitudes, I now know or do or believe something different than I had in the past. So whichever type of learning you're writing about in your reflection, make sure that you end up there. You end up with that kind of final statement or final section that explains how you now know, do, or believe something differently than you did before whatever you were reflecting on happened to you. So if you read a book and maybe it was a book about a different culture of the world that you had no experience or you had you'd never met somebody from that culture. Well, now you have more information about that culture. You maybe have attached some value or some importance to that culture. And that has changed the way that learning has changed what you know or changed what you believe about that culture. Just as an example, again, reading a book can be a form of learning. So whatever you're writing about, whatever you're reflecting on, it's very important that you end up in that place where you're explaining how you have changed, how what you know, do, or believe has changed. So in academic writing, most of the time we could reflect on two things. You'll be asked to reflect on one of these two, either an experience or an event, or an idea or a theory. So what's the difference? Well, an experience or an event is something that you attended that happened to you. Some examples of this could be a guest lecturer. Maybe your instructor invited somebody in to talk about something relevant to your topic in class, and you are asked to reflect on the guest lecture. Maybe you attended a job fair as part of your program, and you're asked to reflect on that event. Ideas or theory, of course, these are ideas, new information. It's not something necessarily that you attended, but it was something that was taught to you. So this could be a new idea in class or an idea from a textbook, a theory from a textbook, just for a few examples. But again, in academic writing, we're typically asked to reflect on those two things. So let's look at the structure, a structure for reflective writing. First part we're going to look at is a description of the idea, a description of the event, then your interpretation, and finally the outcome. And the outcome, as we'll see in a little bit, has to do with that statement from a couple slides ago. I now know, do, or believe something different. So in the next slide, we'll go over each section in detail. So description. Here are some questions you could use when writing this part of a reflection. You'll want to describe the topic of reflection. So what happened, if it was an experience or event, what is being examined, right? So what idea or theory is being reflected on? What is it? This is objective, of course. So the writer doesn't share your opinion. So if you had a guest lecturer to your class and you didn't like it, you did not think it was valuable, maybe you thought that the lecturer was not relevant to your module in class or something, for whatever reason, it wasn't your favorite. This is not the part of the reflection where you would necessarily discuss your feelings about that experience. Maybe you were asked to read a chapter of a textbook and you were asked to reflect on, a key idea from that chapter. Maybe you don't agree with that key idea. Maybe that is not something that you believe to be true, or you have experience that goes against that idea. This again, this part of the reflection, the description part, would not be where you would say that. At this point, you are simply giving a description of what you are reflecting on. A guest lecturer came to my class. I read a chapter from my textbook that discussed this theory. Here's a definition of that theory. So keeping it objective, keeping your opinions, feelings, thoughts out for now. The next part is, of course, the interpretation. This is where you start to reflect a bit more. You're not just describing or giving detail. Now you are interpreting what has happened. So you could ask yourself, what is important or interesting or useful or relevant from that experience, from that idea, whatever you're reflecting on. How did the experience or idea impact or affect you in the moment? You may be you may need to think from different perspectives. You may need to break it into smaller sections. For example, if you went to a job fair, again, that would be an event that you are reflecting on. Maybe there were many important pieces. Maybe you realized how important networking is. Maybe you made a really good connection with somebody from a company that you really want to work for. Maybe you made a mistake and you didn't have your cover letter with you when it was asked. Maybe you collected all of the business cards, but you lost them. I don't know. You had all of these important or relevant experiences that were part of that job fair. So at this point, you need to do some critical thinking or analysis to decide what is important, interesting, useful, relevant. What are you wanting to reflect on? So that's why that break it into smaller pieces involves critical thinking. You can't you can't reflect on everything, possibly, especially if you're writing a discussion post and the limit is 150 words. You have to make a smart choice here about the interesting, useful, relevant piece of whatever you're reflecting on. So that's the second section. You've described it. You've kind of given more information about that piece that you are reflecting on. And now the outcome. So this is where that proof of learning comes into play. You have to prove that learning has taken place. So the I now know, or I now do, or I now feel or think differently, that's where you write that. So how does this affect your future? Whatever learning has happened, whatever you now know, or whatever you now do differently or think differently, how will that impact your future? And that's the proof of learning. You've learned something that has changed your behaviors moving forward. So description, interpretation, and outcome. Couple more notes about how to identify a reflective writing assignment, and then we'll look at some examples in a few slides. So you may have reflective writing assignments and not realize it. Your instructors aren't necessarily going to say, reflective writing assignment on job fair. That would be really lovely if they would make it really, really clear like that all of the time. But the reality is that we can be asked to reflect on an experience or an idea in many different ways, academically and in professional situations. So you may come across some of this common language that is used to ask for your reflections on something. And it might look like this. Think about a time when. Consider what we discussed during class. That's a really common one, that consider. That's a really good synonym or a really important synonym for reflect that you should know as a student. If you're being asked to consider something, you're being asked to analyze it. So reflection is going to be part of that, especially if some learning, some proof of learning is being requested. Your instructor wants to know what you've learned. Of course, reflect on your experience in light of your recent learning. That phrase, in light of something. Now that you know, or now that you did something, in light of it. Okay. What do you think? So in light of your experience at the job fair, share your thoughts. It could be something like that. The word reflect isn't in there at all, but you are being asked to provide a description, your interpretation, and to provide an outcome or proof of learning based on that experience. Review the content from the last module and share your thoughts on the most important information in Module 2 from this course. What you're being asked there is to describe what you learned in Module 2, give an interpretation of what was the most useful, relevant, interesting to you, and then provide that outcome, that statement that shows what you learned and how it will affect you moving forward or in the future. And even the word discuss something that you've learned. When we discuss something, we don't necessarily just give facts. That's not much of a discussion. A discussion involves you to talk about the usefulness, the relevancy of something, and then to discuss how it's impacted you or affected you. That's reflecting. So all of these phrases and more may come up in your classes, maybe part of assignments for writing assignments, but also just maybe part of class time. And what you're being asked there to do is this structure of description, interpretation, and providing an outcome. All right. Again, we're going to look at some examples very shortly. But all of this to say that reflective writing is more personal than other types of writing. So, personal meaning about you. You're being asked to share what you think. If your instructor asks you to write something and it's a reflection, and maybe some of this language shows up there, but you're being asked to write a reflection on something, they really want to know how it has impacted you, your learning, your beliefs, your skills. So here are some very common writing task examples or reflective writing task examples. A book report. A book report requires you to read something, a book, and then share your thoughts, share your opinions. If you simply wrote facts about the book or a summary of the book, well, that is okay. That's part of it, absolutely. You have to introduce the reading that you have done. But if that's all you did, that would just be a summary. If you're being asked to reflect or discuss or consider or share your thoughts on a book for a book report, your instructor is looking for not just proof that you learned facts about the book or proof that you can summarize the book. You're not supposed to prove that you read it. You need to show what you learned and how that will impact you. So you can use this reflective writing structure that I've shared, description, interpretation, outcome, to show what you learned from that book. That's what's important. It's not important that necessarily you know the author's name or the year it was published or that you can give a summary of the chapters. That may be important too, but that proof of learning happens in describing how it affected or impacted you and how it will continue to based on what you now know or do or think differently. The same goes for an article review. If you're asked to read an academic article, these can have a lot of information and take a long time to read if it's a complex academic article. But again, your instructor doesn't necessarily need proof that you read the thing. They want proof of what you have learned. So same goes for a book report. I've mentioned discussion board posts a few times during this presentation. Discussion board posts are a very common way of your instructor saying, hey, we did this thing, or hey, we went to this thing as a class. Share your thoughts with your classmates. If you were to just write in the discussion post, I attended the guest lecture. Well, what we're missing again there is, oh, sorry, that's okay. What we're missing again there is that you haven't showed what you now know based on that experience. And a learning journal. Lots of programs request that students keep kind of a journal or a log of what they're learning and how it's impacted and what's important in their learning. So the same goes for all these types of assignments. All right, it's time to analyze two examples of reflective writing. So this first one, or for both of them, I would like you to determine whether you're looking at a reflection of an idea or a reflection of an experience. And then also to try to identify the three sections that we've talked about. So description, interpretation, and outcome. All right, so let's look at the first one here. Example 1. So I recently read the book Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Talaga. This book covers the death of 7 Indigenous teenagers who all came to Thunder Bay from remote communities to attend high school between 2000 and 2011. An inquest into the deaths concluded in 2016 with 131 recommendations. At the time, I didn't realize how limited the schooling options were for Indigenous youth in many parts of Ontario, as well as in my province, Manitoba. This is significant because many Indigenous teens must travel far distances, often stay in strangers' homes, and navigate brand new communities just to continue their education. These situations can leave youth vulnerable, which was the case for the 7 young people Talaga discusses in her book. Reading this book has significantly developed my understanding of our current education system. These stories have made me realize that a lot needs to change so that all children have access to the human right of education. This understanding is essential to me as an educator and as a Canadian because education in Canada claims to be and should be equitable and safe for all. Okay, so this is maybe we could fit that into the type of book report. It's very short, but it could kind of be a book report because it's a report or reflection on a book. So is this writer reflecting on an idea or an experience? And can you identify these sections? Okay, I see a little bit of information in the chat here. Let's see. Good. So this author is reflecting on an idea, something that they learned while reading this book. And can you identify the sections? This should be pretty easy. 3 sections, 3 paragraphs, but let's look at them a little more in detail. So in the description, as we talked about before, the book is being described, kind of the key idea or the the main theme of the book, let's say. You should also notice that the author has not shared their opinion about the book. I don't know if they liked it. I don't know if they didn't like it. I don't know if it was boring, interesting, long, short. Those kind of subjective pieces or, feelings about the book aren't in this portion. So that's very important to remember when writing a description. But now the proof of learning continues. So we have the interpretation. In this section, the author of this reflection has pulled out some of the most or key pieces of information that she learned when writing or when reading this book. So this book, I've actually read this book, has tons of very, very in-depth and complex pieces of information. Okay, but the person who read this book, this is what they felt was the most important or the most interesting when reading this book. So if you and your classmates read a book, let's say you all read this book, Seven Fallen Feathers, you should probably have 20 different ideas about what was the most interesting or the most relevant to you when you were reading that book. So that's again connected to this idea that reflections are very personal types of writing. They are not going to all be the same. If you all read the same book, all of your reflections should be very different because it's what you think, what you learned, and how it impacted you. So in this case, the author pulled out the idea that schooling is very limited if you're an Indigenous person wanting to study in Canada. And the final section, the outcome, of course, involves that piece of, okay, I now know this, and this is how it will impact my thinking moving forward and my beliefs moving forward. Let's look at one more very quickly. I know I'm running out of time here. During my 4-week practicum at Child Center ABC, I worked with 3 to 5-year-old children. I was responsible for preparing and leading the children in an activity every day, ranging from outdoor play to arts, from music to read-alouds. For me, the most important experience in my practicum was learning how to plan activities in advance. Previously, I thought all children were similar in their ability levels and interests. Due to time, I'm going to skip over the end of that paragraph to the last one. Because of this experience, I have significantly developed my ability to plan a lesson as an early childhood educator. I now know to take into account children's developmental stages and general interests while preparing learning activities. This skill will be essential as I enter year 2 of the program and eventually the workforce. Okay, so is this writer reflecting on an idea or an experience? Good, I see it in the chat. Experience is correct. And can we identify the sections? Again, 3 paragraphs, 3 sections. That is a very good way to organize a reflection. So this person is reflecting on some work experience, a 4-week practicum. The interpretation includes the most important thing that they learned. I'm sure that this student learned many things during this practicum. They didn't just learn one or two things, they learned many things, but they analyzed their experience, pulled out the most important pieces of their learning, and described it in the interpretation section. And in the lack section, because of this experience, I've developed my ability. So they have, in this case, learned a new skill. And they're describing that skill and why it's important and how it will affect them in the future. Good. All right, so just quickly summarize, reflective writing looks back at past experiences so you can perform better with that information in the future. Instructors ask for reflective writing to assess what you've learned, not to prove that you read the thing or did the thing, but to show or explain what you learned and how it will impact you. Remember that you can learn knowledge, you can learn skills, you can learn attitudes. And no matter what kind of learning you're writing about, make sure you describe how your learning will cause you to think about things or do things differently in the future. That description, interpretation, outcome model will help you structure your reflective writing assignments the next time that you have to sit down and do one, whether it's a discussion post, book report, learning journal, etc. All right, thank you very much for attending this workshop. I appreciate the participation in the chat. That was fantastic. Because you attended this workshop today, I will make sure to email you the tip sheet. The practice activity, if you would like to give this a try, we've created a practice activity for you. So this will be available on the website, and you can email your completed work to writing@rrc.ca, and one of our writing tutors will take a look and give you feedback on your reflective writing practice. So this is a low stakes opportunity for you to practice and demonstrate what you've learned today before you have to, reflect and hand something into your instructor. Our next workshop is next week, Wednesday, same time, same WebEx link, and it is on paragraph structure. So it is the 4th out of 7. As you can see, we have 4 more coming up. So it's every Wednesday for the next 4 weeks. If you have any questions about that, you're always welcome to email me or email writing@rrc.ca. Check out our website. We have lots of supports for students who are English language learners, or if you have different writing assignments that you'd like to talk to a writing tutor about, and many more resources on our website. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you again so much for attending today, and have a great day. Good luck with your reflective writing assignments.